Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog here on MintPress. As always, we are going against the grain and covering the stories which are regularly ignored by the mainstream media. However, this week we have a story which the mainstream media has been unable to ignore. A product marketing manager at Google by the name of Ariel Koren has resigned in protest against the company's pro-Israeli bias. Now, she has published a very powerful letter of resignation, which I would recommend all viewers to check out. In it, she says, Google systematically silences Palestinian, Jewish, Arab, and Muslim voices concerned about Google's complicity in violations of Palestinian human rights, to the point of formally retaliating against workers and creating an environment of fear. In my experience, silencing dialogue and dissent in this way has helped Google protect its business interests with the Israeli military and government. Now, these are powerful words. In the letter, Ariel details some of the aspects in which an internal, unelected, Jugular's grouping of Jewish Google employees have been working against the upswelling of support among Jewish, Palestinian, non-Palestinian, Muslim, and other groups of people who are pushing forth to support the Palestinians, particularly in light of the 2021 announcement that Google, along with Amazon, would be building a cloud system for the Israeli government and military under the name of Project Nimbus. So we are very fortunate this week to have with us Ariel Koren, who has been all over the place and I'm sure is in great demand to talk to people. It's absolutely vital that we support courageous people like Ariel who have taken this step to assert their solidarity with Palestinian people. Thank you for joining us, Ariel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So just to start with, if you could take us to the beginning of your journey with Google, how did it start?
Yeah, I joined Google 7 years ago. So I worked at Google for 7 years. I started fresh out of college. And like many other young people who joined the company, I was excited about a lot of the values that the company purports to have. Specifically, I'm also an interpreter. And when I initially joined the company, it was to work at Google Translate. So I was excited about, promoting language democracy, making universal access to information possible for people. And particularly for linguistically marginalized people, right? That was something that was really exciting to me. At some point during my time within the company, I, alongside many other workers, started to bear witness to a lot of deeply concerning company behaviors. Over the past few years, Google has begun to aggressively pursue military contracts. 4 years ago, Google took on a project that is called Project Maven, which is essentially a drone precision contract, essentially a deal between Google and the Pentagon in the United States to help with precisely identifying targets for drones. And this was an extremely lucrative and extremely concerning project. It was one of kind of the biggest moments where we saw Google working in a militaristic capacity, and a very large number, thousands of workers took issue with this, started to protest. There were engineers who were close to the project who threatened work stoppages. And we really, just as workers, took a stand and petitioned the company and told Google that we were concerned. Eventually, Google did drop Project Maven as a result of so much worker outcry. The worker outcry was internal, but it also reached the public, and there was so much pressure that Google eventually did decide to cancel the project. But unfortunately, this project has not been the last time that we've seen Google pursue this sort of extremely unethical business. And Project Nimbus, which is what I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about, is the latest kind of contract that Google has chosen to enter into that is cause for deep concern and that many of us workers view as an extremely urgent crisis of conscience. So Project Nimbus is a $1.2 billion contract between Google and Amazon and the Israeli military and government. It was launched last year during May of 2021. Right after the siege on Gaza, during which over 250 Palestinian people were killed at the hands of Israeli military violence. And the contract is actually providing tools to the Israeli government and military that will help the government and military scale out a multitude of forms of violence, including surveillance, data collection, the expansion of illegal settlement expansion. There are a lot of different forms of violence that Google is essentially aiding and abetting through Project Nimbus. And it would be extremely concerning at any time. But the fact that Google decided to launch the contract literally right after the siege on Gaza felt, it was not a coincidence. It felt like a very intentional attack. And so it almost added insult to injury and became an impetus for us as workers to take a stand. And we knew that we needed to do something. So to answer your question in terms of what my trajectory has been like at Google, I think over the years, I've seen Google increasingly not only pursue these sorts of really violent contracts unapologetically, but also expand its infrastructure around censoring its workforce and retaliating against people who speak out about these sorts of contracts and about these sorts of company behaviors. We've seen several instances of folks who take a role in holding the company accountable when these sort of contracts are announced, just being blatantly ousted from the company, either in the form of being fired or in the form of the company creating some sort of obstacle that makes it impossible for the worker to actually remain in the company and to feel like they can get their job done, right? So essentially just creating a situation where they're not firing you in order to avoid any sort of legal accountability, but they are just making the situation completely impossible. In my case, it was that right after I spoke out about the contracts, Project Nimbus, they just moved my role overseas and told me that I had 17 days to commit to moving or else I would lose my job. So they're essentially telling me that there was a business justification, but it was in the middle of the pandemic. No one was working from the Sao Paulo offices where they told me I had to move. And so it was just really clear that it was an act of retaliation and they just wanted to make it impossible. So all this to say, these are some of the issues that workers have been confronting. And I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that, when Google pursues these sorts of violent contracts, it's always concerning. But one of the compounding factors here is that this is a contract with the Israeli government and military. And Google has a really deeply ingrained culture of institutionalized Zionist bias, institutionalized bias against particularly Palestinian workers and all workers who express support or act in solidarity with Palestinian workers and Palestinians on the ground who are ultimately directly impacted by Google's behaviors. So I think it's just really important to emphasize that one of the challenges that we're coming up against is the fact that that Google has this deeply ingrained culture and it uses this culture. It's as a weapon. It's purposely creating this culture that it sustains of silencing its Palestinian colleagues, its Palestinian workers, and all of the folks who are allies to Palestinians in order to insulate itself from any sort of opposition to its business interests with Israel. And so I think it's really important to amplify the testimonies that Palestinian workers provided of their experiences. And we can definitely probably share those with anyone who's watching and listening, because it's a culture of extreme suppression and discrimination that we're hoping to raise awareness about, and that the general public can hold the company accountable to changing as well.
Also, it is of interest at MintPress because algorithmically, around the time of Project Owl, MintPress saw its traffic absolutely plummet, as did other websites, anti-war websites. It's believed that informally there seems to be an algorithmic bias against sites like this, but also there is the other question of whether Google has informally, not explicitly, but implicitly adopted a definition of anti-Semitism, which includes anti-Zionism. Would you be able to speak to that?
Definitely. Yes. So you mentioned when we were chatting beforehand about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So as a summary for folks, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism essentially states that criticism of Israel, holding Israel to just basic human rights standards, essentially constitutes as anti-Semitic violence, constitutes as discrimination against Jewish people. What those of us who are progressive Jews, and so many of us know, Jewish folks from the diaspora, what we know is that the main cause and the majority of anti-Semitic hatred and bigotry and instances is rooted in white nationalist violence. And that criticism of Israel and criticism of the Israeli government and anti-Zionism, that is not discrimination against Jews. That is simply holding a country that is committing egregious war crimes, that is perpetrating apartheid and settler colonialism. It's just holding that government accountable. But unfortunately, many folks who are Zionists and who are, putting forward narratives that are meant to insulate Israel from any criticism have engaged in what's called weaponizations of anti-Semitism, which is when someone seeks to quelch or to silence any sort of criticism of Israel by accusing critics of Israel of anti-Semitism. And it's something that we see across institutions, but it's happening in an extremely concerning way in Google. And it's concerning when it happens at any institution, but when the world's largest search engine is putting forward false narratives of anti-Semitism in order to silence and censor human rights activists and discussions about human rights, it's cause for really, really deep concern. And so many of us in the company, particularly those of us who are Jewish workers within the company, we started to become aware of the extent to which this is creating a culture of censorship. Essentially, you mentioned the Juglers. This is a group which it stands for kind of the Jewish Googlers or the Juglers. So it's kind of like the formal company ERG, which means Employee Resource Group. So the ERG system is basically like it's a set of different groups that are meant to represent different minority communities. So folks who have ethnic identities, racial identities that are minoritized, religious identities, sexual orientation, et cetera. There's, anyone who belongs into a marginalized community has a corresponding ERG group. And those employee resource groups are essentially used by company leadership to serve as a formalized representation of that community within the company and is expected to represent the interests of that community within the company and to also ultimately to impact the way the company makes decisions about how it speaks to and about those communities on the external level as well. So within the Jewish ERG, what has happened is that there's a pretty small minority of people, and they're small, but they're extremely vocal, and they hold the power over the group, who are very, unfortunately, radical right-wing folks who are extremely Zionist and extremely committed to many right-wing ideologies. Let me let this sound fit in the background pass. I'm sorry. This is our washing machine. It makes like a very long noise. I don't know why. It's very long. Okay, there we go. So where was it? Okay. They are a small but extremely vocal, minority of people who have taken power and control over the Jewish ERG, and they're people who espouse very deep right-wing ideologies, including a very deep commitment to Zionism above all, really. And so what has happened is that...
Sorry, just to confirm, this group in a way functions as an internal lobby group.
Absolutely. So it's important to kind of mention this weaponization of Google's diversity infrastructure, because the group is supposedly supposed to represent the interests of the Jewish community across Google, but particularly as it pertains to fighting any sort of discrimination or anti-Semitism. So while the group is purporting to be this kind of diversity group that is a part of Google's equity and inclusion framework, what the group is doing what the group is actually doing is serving as a mouthpiece for right-wing ideologies, including Zionism. And so one of the biggest concerns that we had is that this group has institutionalized in writing. It is a formal policy that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, stating that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. They have formally adopted this definition of anti-Semitism. So
just to confirm, this is the ERG Jugulars group has officially adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Google as a company hasn't, but because this group within it has adopted this, then that definition has become dominant within the company.
Exactly. Google claims to not have officially adopted the IRA definition. Like, to our knowledge, we have not seen that the company has taken that official stance. However, to your point, the ERG system, what it means is that each group within the system is the authority on that community's voice and on representing that community's interests. So the group that serves as a group that is formally funded by the company, they receive company funding, they have a direct platform to meet regularly with leadership all the way up to the most executive leaders at the company, representing the interests of the Jewish diaspora, supposedly. They have institutionalized this definition of anti-Semitism, and they have been engaged ever since I have been, within Google, and from what I've seen, they have been engaged in extremely intentional, coordinated campaign to lobby the company as a whole to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
And also in your letter, you describe, at least to my memory, 2 examples where the group has successfully lobbied the company to do particular things. So the first is a donation following the killing of George Floyd in the spirit of Black Lives Matter. The second is basically obtaining statements from Google's leadership regarding 2021. Can you just tell us about those 2 instances where Google was successfully lobbied by this internal lobby group?
Yes. So 2020 was the first time. I'm sure it wasn't the first time that it happened, but it was the first time that I, as a worker, became made aware of an actual concrete kind of material financial result or impact of the Jugulars lobbying efforts. And it was really the moment that was kind of the impetus for myself and many other colleagues to become activated around organizing within the company. So what happened is that during 2020, during the movement for Black Lives uprisings, Google made an official company donation to the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of many different groups, collectives, and organizations that are leading the fight against anti-Black racism and violence across the United States and even beyond. And the company's donation was something that was widely supported by, I would hope, most folks within the company. However, after the company made that donation, there was an email that was sent to the Jugulars group, which essentially means anyone who identifies as Jewish within the company received this email. And it was a formal apology. So it was sent from the director of Google.org, which is Google's philanthropic branch. And it was formally apologizing for the donations that were made to the Movement for Black Lives. And the reason for the apology was, what it was stated in the email, was that the leadership of Jugulars had made a formal complaint on behalf of all Jews in the company, saying that the Movement for Black Lives donation was anti-Semitic inherently because of the fact that certain groups within the coalition expressed an alignment with the language of the Palestinian-led organizations who are leading the fight for Palestinian freedom. So the director of Google.org essentially issued an apology and said next time that he would be checking in with the Jugulars to make sure everything was okay. And he made it very clear that, he was taking their concerns seriously. And so myself and other anti-Zionist Jews, and also just progressive Jews generally, we were absolutely mortified. It was just such an infuriating moment because this was like in the midst of the uprisings. And we just felt like it was such an inappropriate and horrible email to receive that there would be an apology for donating to the group that's leading the fight against anti-Black racism in the United States. It was so mortifying. So we immediately crafted a letter that was signed by Jewish folks from across the company who were just completely mortified. And we said in our letter, we are calling on Google leadership to take back the statement, to retract the apology, and to stand firmly by the donations that were made. And we also included in our letter that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is not something that represents all Jews or even the majority of Jews. And in fact, that the majority of Jews in the diaspora reject the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, particularly progressive Jewish groups. Almost all of them have rejected IRA. And so we just told the company, like, you should not be centering non-Black voices at this time period, but you certainly shouldn't be centering right-wing voices if you are trying to consider, the interests of the Jewish community, because this is a weaponization of anti-Semitism. The company ignored our email. They did not respond. But what they did do is that they followed up with a formal donation. And this all was happening in the midst of the movement for Black Lives uprisings. They made a $400,000 donation to 4 different right-wing organizations that are all led by non-Black people. They are non-Black groups who are known for being right-wing and driving forward right-wing ideologies. And they said that they were doing that in the spirit of diversity and in solidarity against anti-Semitism. And all of the groups that received the donations are groups that are actively involved in funneling support to the Israeli army, in funneling support to the Israeli government, and in driving forward essentially propaganda, the Zionist propaganda that is meant to erase the experience and the reality for Palestinians on the ground. So that was kind of the first example.
Now, your fate as a Google employee is deeply entwined with this project of Project Nimbus. Now, Shannon Newberry, the Google spokesperson, told TechCrunch the following about Project Nimbus. She said, "We are proud that Google Cloud has been selected by the Israeli government to provide public cloud services to help digitally transform the country. The project includes making Google Cloud Platform available to government agencies for everyday workloads such as finance, healthcare, transportation, and education, and it is not directed to highly sensitive or classified workloads. We also know, though, following a report by The Intercept, that actually it has offered advanced AI machine learning to the Israeli government. And also, very importantly, you see something in the contract, a clause in the contract, which essentially prevents Google, hypothetically, from shutting down the services in the event of employee protest or otherwise. So it kind of binds Google and Amazon into this particular relationship. Now, those government agencies that Project Nimbus would be catering to would include Israel's military and also the Israel Land Authority, which divvies up the seized Palestinian land for the illegal settlements in the West Bank. We also know that the Nimbus training has put forward this idea that faces, facial landmarks, emotion detection, all of that would be available in Project Nimbus. And also, as mentioned in your letter, in one Nimbus training webinar, a Google engineer confirmed to an Israeli customer that it would be possible to process data through Nimbus in order to determine if someone is lying. Now, this sparked the internal petition, which I know you were involved in, which had at least 800 people from within Google and 37,500 people outside of Google signing this petition against the Project Nimbus. Now, just so we can get this sort of trajectory clear, it was following that that you returned to work and were given this this choice of either going to work in Sao Paulo in Brazil or lose your job. And you had about 3 weeks to make your decision. Following on from that, you personally had 700 Google employees and 25,000 people outside the company signing this petition of support with yourself. However, eventually you've now resigned and have made clear that Google was a hostile work environment for you. Now, Google's HR team actually acknowledged that this attempt to relocate you to Brazil was quote unquote improper and harmful, but it has claimed that there is no evidence of retaliation. Now, this sounds like quite clearly a textbook case of retaliation towards you. If you could just break down for us some of the other examples of retaliation that have taken place across the company to people that have spoken out in support of the Palestinians and against this closer and closer, this integrating of Google with the Israeli military and mechanisms of power.
Yeah, the culture of retaliation, it's pervasive. It is happening across the company. So there are a lot of examples. It's hard to even know where to begin. When I resigned, the day that I resigned, a group of 15 different workers, many of whom are Palestinian, actually shared their experiences and their firsthand accounts of witnessing retaliation and institutionalized company-sanctioned harassment against Palestinians and folks who support Palestinian rights. So a few examples, there have been many people who have been issued HR warnings simply for sharing news about what's happening in Palestine. There were some of the folks who shared testimonies actually mentioned that just identifying as Palestinian, not even taking a stance, but just saying, I am Palestinian, led them to be accused of being anti-Semitic, which is just, it is so incredibly wild that this is the reality that's actually happening within the company. There is someone who provided a testimony who essentially was just wearing traditional Palestinian clothing and was wearing keffiyeh, basically, like in the picture that they had in their company profile. And as a result of that, was called into HR and literally was told that this was a problem, that they had been reported to HR, and that this was considered to be divisive, that they were just wearing their own clothing to express their own cultural identity. And this is a company that explicitly celebrates itself as being a leader in diversity and equity and inclusion. Like, they have built an entire brand around the idea that they're the leader of DEI. There was a worker, and this was reported on actually in the New York Times article that came out this week. There was a worker who was not Palestinian, but was openly expressing allyship and solidarity with the Palestinian cause, had written Free Palestine in their company page. We all have a page, right? A profile within the company. So they just wrote Free Palestine. They were then called into HR and issued a formalized warning. And then after they received that warning, they continued just to put out news about what's happening in Palestine. They were sharing articles and support in different company fora. Mind you, it's very common for people to talk about social justice issues in Google, because it's one of those companies that say you should bring your full self to work and that we should have these discussions. So that's not out of the ordinary. But in this case, the worker was speaking out for Palestine. They were then called into HR and they were told they would not be receiving their bonus. So they lost their bonus, which essentially was over $10,000 that they lost. And they also received a performance deduction. They were issued a needs improvement, which is the lowest score you could get at Google. And it often leads workers to be put on a performance plan or to be managed out of the company. So it was an extremely kind of concrete and material example of like real ramifications, and there are other folks who expressed just seeing their friends being called into HR and issued warnings. I have very many friends from within the company, many of whom are Palestinian, who have been issued warnings for a diversity of different things but none of them it should actually ever result in a warning. Literally just sharing their viewpoints, talking about their ethnic identity, talking about being Palestinian. And this kind of behavior, it's clearly unlawful, right? It's discrimination on the basis of national origin and ethnicity. It's extremely unlawful behavior. And it's a huge part of the reason why many of our Palestinian colleagues within the company have not been afforded the privilege of feeling safe speaking out, because of the fact that this culture of suppression exists, and it's compounded with a very genuine fear that speaking out could also not only have very harmful job and career implications and financial implications, but could also mean endangering folks' families and not being able to travel back home and visit their families. So there's just all of these compounded layers of suppression and censorship, unfortunately.
So do you think it would be fit to put it that Google functions for its employees as an internal surveillance system enforcing a pro-Israeli line on employees?
I don't know. Okay, this is off the record. I don't know if I have the evidence to say it's a surveillance system.
Okay.
But I do know, what I can say is that, workers are extremely scared and feel surveilled. People genuinely feel surveilled. They genuinely feel that they're being watched by the company. They don't feel comfortable. For a very long time, folks have not felt comfortable speaking about Palestine within the company. And I think that's been really exacerbated since last year, since 2021 of May, because in May 2021, we saw some of the most concrete and widespread examples of Google's explicit erasure of Palestinians and its explicit bias towards, a pro-occupation, pro-military occupation stance. Leaders as executive as Sundar, who's our CEO, and Susan Wojcicki, who is our CEO of YouTube. Both of them came out with statements that erased Palestinians explicitly. And that even during a time when the entire global community was up in arms, declaring the siege on Gaza to be a needless act of military violence. Even during a time when Amnesty International was coming out and echoing what Palestinians have been saying for decades, and the global community has been saying for decades, calling Israel an apartheid government. You still have leaders across Google in the most executive of positions expressing support and just a very clearly pro-Israeli military, pro-occupation stance that they're seeking to normalize within the company.
I mean, in a way, one could see the Project Nimbus as the sort of climax or crescendo of a long push and attritional war by Israel to harness Google to do what it wants. So, for example, you have several organizations which have been set up for the clear purpose of moving people from Unit 8200, which is the Israel Signal Communications Military Intelligence Unit, which surveils Palestinian electronic communications, into organizations like Google. One example is Startup Nation Central, which was founded by Paul E. Singer. Paul E. Singer himself, who through his Paul E. Singer Foundation funds Birthright Israel, funds the Friends of the IDF, funds the Israel Independence Fund, the NGO Monitor, the European Foundation for Democracy, and Memory also. Paul Singer is also one of the top donors to the Republican Party. Now, he was inspired by this book, Startup Nation, by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. Saul Singer is no relation of Paul Singer. And so off the back of it, he set up this organization, which is directly linked to Benjamin Netanyahu's policy, what they called a deliberate policy, to have former members of these military and intelligence units merge with companies in order to make it impossible for major corporations and foreign governments to boycott Israel. Now, this organization was started alongside somebody by the name of Eugene Kandel. Now, Eugene Kandel was the national economic advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu, and also the management team of Startup Nation Central included Guy Hilton. Now, Guy Hilton was formerly a marketing executive at the Israeli telecommunications company Amdocs, which had been revealed by a Fox News investigation in 2001 to be investigated by several federal agencies on the basis that it had partaken in an espionage operation targeting the US government. We also look at the board of directors at Startup Nation Central, and we see not only Paul Singer and Dan Senor, but we also see Raphael Uzan. Now, Uzan was an officer in the Unit 8200 in the Israeli military. We also know of a clear connection when we look at Uzan's non-profit Israel Tech Challenge organization being connected to Google in quite a clear way. Google is put forth as a supporter of the Israel Tech Challenge organization. Then we have, in addition to that, other interesting examples, like an organization by the name of The Bridge, which is linked to Startup Nation Central. The Bridge functions in a similar way and has support from Mercedes-Benz and Coca-Cola. These are quite interesting connections. But then also you have the interesting example of an organization called Team 8, which is also promoted by Startup Nation Central, that has similar objectives to Startup Nation Central. And Team 8 actually has a very clear and direct link to Google through the investor being the former head of Google, Eric Schmidt. So there's a number of ways in which specific tech companies have been set up with the objective of moving former Israeli military personnel into important positions within big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. You also have the example with YouTube and its Trusted Flagger program of adopting the Anti-Defamation League as a trusted flagger, a contributing member of that program. Now, the Anti-Defamation League, for those that don't know, it has a history of spying not only on anti-apartheid activists, also Arab student groups. It also started this Silicon Valley anti-cyber hate working group, which actually includes Google. Now, the ADL has a definition of anti-Semitism, which includes anti-Zionism. It explicitly states anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, but also in internal FBI memos in 1969, you have it stated clearly that, and it's the exact words which are quoted in the FBI memo, it is incredible to assume that the ADL is not furnished to an official of the Israeli government. And the FBI in this memo wonder whether the ADL is in violation of the US Foreign Agents Registration Act. There's numerous people in quite important positions within Google who are former Unit 8200. And in fact, Whitney Webb found that there were at least 28 former members of Unit 8200 currently employed by Google. So there's a sort of infrastructure that has worked to make this reality. And what we're dealing with in a lot of ways, I would say, is the manifestation of that policy which was enacted by the Netanyahu government about 10 years ago, and that mission creep of working to sort of harness Google as a weapon against Palestinian solidarity. You know, for example, at that point in 2012, an artist like myself with songs which are very clearly pro-Palestinian, and, you know, a website like MintPress that had a lot of very critical work on Israeli intelligence, algorithmically, we did not face the same kind of barriers that we seem to face today. So it's sort of this policy that seems to be getting rolled out internally to Google also seems to be rolled out across the board outside of Google also. It's interesting to me, though, that there has been quite widespread support for yourself and other Google employees who have been active against Project Nimbus. Could you tell us a bit about the support that you have received?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for everything you just shared, because I think it's really, really important. And you shared so many different things. But, I'm really glad that you brought up the Intercept article that reported on the documents that essentially were leaked from Project Nimbus, which showed that the statement that has been provided by Google saying that this is a neutral contract, that there's really nothing neutral about it. This is a contract that even in the Israeli media is being reported as a contract that is going to have the military as a beneficiary, and that is going to be providing extremely powerful surveillance technology and other forms of powerful AI tools to the government and military in Israel. And you also mentioned, I believe, a clause in the contract that says that Google has no right to regulate the way that the tools get used. And also, Google is not allowed to regulate which agencies get to use the technology. So that means that they're building out this technology and then no responsibility, wiping their hands of any sort of responsibility. And you mentioned that the ILA, the Israel Land Authority, is going to be one of the beneficiaries. They're the agency that scales out illegal settlement expansion. So, this is what this statement that this is a neutral contract. We know that is not true. There is nothing neutral about providing technology to a government that is violating human rights on a daily basis, and much less when the technology you're providing is surveillance technology and powerful AI tools. So I think that's really important that you mentioned that. And you also mentioned the partnership with the ADL and the fact that within Google, there's been a lot of support for institutionalizing definitions of anti-Semitism that serve as kind of a tool for censorship, and that there's this formalized partnership between the group that has been one of the leaders in trying to really disseminate this idea that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism should be institutionalized across large tech companies, and in this case, the world's largest search engine. And I think it's really, really important that people are aware of that, and the fact that the ADL does have a history of weaponizing anti-Semitism. And when Google made a series of donations to different groups that were led by non-Black folks during the movement for Black Lives protests, one of those groups, there were a few, but one of them was the ADL. And it was during the time where the ADL itself was actually coming out and acknowledging that their programming, where they were investing money in actually sending police forces from the United States abroad to Israel to learn from the Israeli military and then come back and use those practices to harm Black and Brown communities within the United States, that was the same time during which Google was making those donations, supposedly in the name of anti-Semitism. And now to see that YouTube has a formal partnership with the ADL, where the ADL is actually helping to curate content and to supposedly ensure that content is not anti-Semitic, right? What that really means is that the ADL is being platformed by YouTube and by the world's largest search engine to censor content that would tell the truth about what's happening in Palestine. So I just think it's really important to emphasize that. And okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but I know you're asking as well about the support within Google. And I think it's so important that people see how much support there is, because these sort of policies being institutionalized, they're a reflection of a culture that's been institutionalized by a small minority within the company that holds an immense amount of power, and folks who are disproportionately in positions of leadership and in executive positions, and who are unfortunately abusing their power in egregious ways. But that does not mean that workers within the company are not mobilizing and building immense amounts of power. And I think that's what our campaign against Project Nimbus is showing. When you have hundreds and hundreds of workers who are pleading with leadership to cancel these contracts, and then you have an entire civil society campaign called No Tech for Apartheid, which was started by Empower Change and Jewish Voice for Peace, but has now been joined by a whole coalition of dozens and dozens of civil society organizations, you know that the masses are really mobilizing, and that this is where, you know, public opinion lies, right? And so when Google retaliated and essentially told me, you know what, you spoke out about Project Nimbus right after they moved my job overseas, and say, you know, you're going to have to either move within 17, you have to commit to moving within 17 days, or you're out of the company. When they did that, what they wanted to do was send a really clear message that anyone else who speaks out and takes a stance, this could happen to you too, and you could be ousted as well. But it's been the opposite effect of, you know, they wanted to create this chilling effect. But what happened is that workers, when they saw that that was happening, they became even more kind of invigorated and activated and started to become really determined to take a stand. And that was that act of retaliation. Once word about it got out within the company, that's when you started to see even more people who were concerned about Nimbus, because they were saying, you know, what is it about this contract that makes Google so determined to retaliate against like a mid-level marketing manager to this extent? Clearly, this contract is extremely problematic. And so you had, you know, you mentioned like over 700 workers who petitioned the company to rescind the act of retaliation. And there was a public petition as well. And also my coworkers successfully lobbied the congressperson in the United States who represents the headquarter districts of Google. They successfully met and lobbied the congressperson to send a letter to Google about her concerns about this act of retaliation. And you know, initially it was just myself and one other coworker of mine named Gabriel Schubener who were speaking out publicly. And then there's a friend of ours, Batul Sayed, who works at Amazon. She's been speaking out publicly, you know, representing Amazon workers and their movement against this contract within Amazon. But at Google, it was myself and Gabriel. And we spoke out initially, really recognizing the fact that as Jewish Google workers, we held an immense amount of privilege. And we wanted to exercise that privilege in speaking out, because we know that the most powerful tool Google has to insulate itself and to protect its business interests with Israel is the silence and the censorship. And that's why we made that decision. But this week, you know, 15 workers shared their testimonies, but also as of this week, 5 workers spoke out non-anonymously for the first time. So we have 5 workers now who have gone public with their names and with their faces, publicly opposing Project Nimbus. And this is a really big deal. 5 is a big number when you think about the fact that Google is an extremely powerful entity. Its market value is larger than countries like Canada, South Korea, Australia, right? Like Google is an extremely powerful entity. And you have workers who are building power internally to hold the company accountable. And the Alphabet Workers Union, which I'm a member of, and a lot of other workers that I've been organizing with are a member of, has taken a formal stance and has this week come out with a statement saying that the Alphabet Workers Union is now calling on Google to rescind Project Nimbus. So what we're seeing is that more and more workers are speaking out, and eventually it's going to be impossible for Google to retaliate against everyone, right?
Really beautiful. I really appreciate your sentiments and your sacrifice and your courage. Ariel, is there anything else you would like to add just before we wrap up the episode?
Yeah, thank you so much again. One thing that I would like to add is I know I mentioned that there is a civil society campaign that was launched in solidarity with the worker-led call to Google and to Amazon to rescind the contract. So this is called No Tech for Apartheid. It was initially launched by Empower Change and by Jewish Voice for Peace, and now has many civil society organizations behind it. And workers in coalition with the No Tech for Apartheid campaign have declared that next Thursday, September 8th, is going to be a national day of action in the United States. So outside of the Google and Amazon offices in Seattle, in New York City, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are calling on as many people as possible, tech workers, Google workers, Amazon workers, but also community organizations, leaders, and the general public, anyone who can make it. We hope that you will be there. We are going to be organizing this direct action, a protest, and we hope to have people show up and show Google and Amazon that we're not going away until this contract goes away, essentially. And you can learn more about this protest at notechforapartheid.com. And I know many folks are not based or maybe don't even have access to these cities. So there will be more opportunities as well. And we hope that across the United States, but also everywhere, I know you're calling in from London as well. Like, we hope that there will be more actions that will follow. And there are also ways in the meanwhile that folks can take action remotely and digitally. We have a petition online. You can share this information, across your social media accounts. You can also send emails to your government officials wherever you're based, because it's government plays an important role here in holding Google accountable to the law, right? And holding Google accountable to its own publicly stated values. So you can write to government officials, and you can also send emails to folks within Google. You could send emails to executives within Google. So there are just a lot of ways to escalate our call on our companies to rescind this contract. So we really appreciate all of the support.
Thank you so much, Ariel. You know what to do, people. This has been another brilliant episode of The Watchdog. Ariel, any support you need, please let me know. We are here. We are with you to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.